Ça veut dire 3 minutes, ça.
Ouais, 3 minutes.
D'accord.
Non, mais enfin, bon, c'est ce que vous avez à dire.
Faites-le moi 2 minutes. Chers amis,
Non, c'est pas pour vous.
Arnaud Lipinski m'a invité à faire le point sur l'historicité du Christ.
Say something about the historicity of Christ.
Le point commun, c'est que dans
And with this, I come back to the problems of the shroud. The common point is that in both cases, the critics were always negative. Various theories, sometimes weird theories, challenged and questioned everything back. So for historicity of Christ, Paul, dating back to the 60s, decided that half of French people consider that the existence of Christ itself had to be considered doubtful, and which is something absurd. There is no doubt as to the existence of Vercingetorix as Caesar, but as to Christ, everything is possible, and quite often there are criticisms by Greek people where they talk of understanding, and it is this work which we carry out also as to the shroud, and all of this created various aspects and doubts. Science very often is based on prerequisites which should be rigorously taken into account and examined. I would like to summarize my report in 15 minutes, so I apologize with the interpreters if I'm obliged to be quick. And I will summarize what's on the report. The Latin and Greek texts, and particularly various texts available to us, are extremely important. As to Latin texts and pagan texts, they are not so numerous. We have always to examine text on the basis of Suetonio, who, like other historians of the beginning of the 2nd century, Emperor Claude sent Jewish away from Rome. Sorry, I cannot read my text because of the projector, which projects a very terrible light on my face. I cannot even manage to see how this document should be read. So Claude sent a Jewish away from Rome who, under the push of Croesus, had become a permanent cause for disorder. So we see here the word Christus instead of Christus, which was a quite common mistake. We have various examples of it. Always on the basis of Suetonio, Nero afflicted them with all of the, afflicted the Christians with all of the various afflictions who were considered superstitious people. And in Vita Neronis, number 16, between 1111 and 13, there is a relationship between Trajan and Christians. There are many charges brought about against Christians. Christians are said to be used to gather at the beginning of the day at the specific date. It was usually on Sunday when they met to consider Christ as God and devote Him as song and chant, and to commit themselves not to commit crimes but to refrain from actions like stealing, crime, untruthfulness, and then they meet together to have a meal together. From what we can read in the letter to Trajan from Plinius. So the investigation carried out considers that Christians non-guilty for the crimes they were charged with, but they tried to push them to abandon their religion, otherwise they are killed. Tacitus in 126-27 mentions Christ as to the pursuit of Christians by Traiano, who died in 117. And we see Christ where their name comes from, had to undergo tortures by Emperor Tiberius. After this superstition, not only in Judea, where this evil in a way appeared for the first time, but also in Rome, in order to try and eliminate this from the world. Tacitus had correctly reread the persecution of Christian of Rome by Nero as something similar to the Christ's execution in Judea under Tiberius. At the time of crucifixion, Pontius Pilate was not yet prefect. He became prefect much later. So the chronicle is very consequent, it's very consistent with facts. As to the pursuit of Jewish people, we have what we see from the historian Joseph. He relates about the career of John Baptist, and he speaks of the sufferings of the Giacomo, and he says, my father, who was a Latinist, had these works in Latin and sometimes made me read this text by Joseph. This is the text. The text is repeated by all of the critics. At that time, Jesus, a wise man, appeared, if we can call him man, since he was author of wonderful actions. He accepted truth joyfully. He attracted many Jewish and many Greek people. He was the Messiah, and upon the claim by some of them, Pontius Pilate sentenced him to the cross. Prophets had already told all of those things, as other 10,000 things, and Christians called like that because of him. Their number increases. We see therefore this figure of Christ, and in particular mention is made of his wonders. This text mentions the Christian people. There is another book which can be compared to this one, and which is the one I'm mentioning, which dates back to the 13th century, which is a kind of deformation of the previous one, which is a little bit moderate. That's why some people says that this is the first text, but in the second text too, mention is made of Christ, and it is said that it was probably he who was the Messiah. In any way, there is a knowledge by Joseph of Christians and Christ, a very precise knowledge. Whatever the problem, whether we need to know whether it's any kind of problem of interpretation, the text has always been published like this. Other Jewish sources, and I will just keep it. The other Jewish sources speak of this fight between Jewish people and Christians, of the polemics. We see that today's Jewish people, do not stress, do not insist upon this policy. What we have to stress is rather confused tradition as to Jesus as a founder of a sect, and there is all of what he preached and everything which is said about the virginity of Mary, which was subject to blames and criticism by pagan people as well as by Jewish people. Very few. We have a text where it is said that Jesus was born by a very poor woman who betrayed her husband, who had been sent away by her fiancé, and made pregnant by a soldier, Ius Paterno. Ius Paterno is the fourth son of the Virgin, as Christian said. All of this brought to Eius Panterus. I think that everything relating to virginity dates back, probably my opinion, but naturally it is just my personal view. It dates back to what happened in Nazareth, where the traders and they controlled birth, and this explains that mention was made already about the fact that Jesus treats his enemies like children of the devil. I think that this collected the rumors in Nazareth. However, there are some deviations and changes which are linked to a specific reality. As to Jesus, the story of Jewish Jesus dates back to Middle Ages. And now I would like to discuss the Christian texts, which are very numerous. We have the New Testament, we have the Gospels, Apostles, Deeds and Writings, Apocalypses, and we have some historical data here. What is the date of this Christian text? There is kind of controversy. There is, however, a kind of agreement reached since to consider that Gospels date back to the 60s, since there was a quite ambiguous prophecy as to the ruin of Jerusalem. We can see the dating of these texts. We know that the famous Anglican Bishop Robinson wrote a book which is a real bomb, which placed all of the Gospels around the 50. We have then Marc Camignac, who is the founder of the magazine Qumran, Claude Trasmontant, who is professor at the Sorbonne, and Jacqueline Gesnow-Bismuth, who speaks of the Jewish problems at University of Sorbonne. I realized that there are various elements which provide us final data. Also, mention is made of scrolls which were found not only in some basilica but also in the Qumran cave. All of this is very discussed. Calacan, who studied these scrolls, says that on the basis of the criteria applied to study scrolls, they are texts dating back to the year 50. Now in the Qumran cave, texts dating back to a previous year were found. To this regard, I cannot define the dating as to the old text. There is a gap of about 30 years, which, however, is irrelevant. What has to be stressed, on the contrary, is that various texts strengthen the historical quality of the New Testament. it was quite in fashion with the liberal criticism of early 19th century to in a way disintegrate those texts. All of what was done to criticize them and say that were not credible and which that they did not provide any historical information, everything which was submitted as an archaeological document confirms the exactness, while for the Gospel by Giacomo, the likeliness or the likeliness that is true comes out of every page. Among the interesting texts, there are the texts of Qumran texts. Once more, I would like to remind you of the controversy about the shroud. As soon as Qumran texts were discovered, Postlever, who is professor at the College of France, unconsciously tried to publish on the Figaro in the 50s. I have here a picture of the article. He tried to introduce a Christ before Christ. He mentioned something who had been crucified and who is going to be back, resuscitating, and the Cardinal Danielou on Le Figaro had quite fairly demonstrated that his assumption was not a solid one. A similar episode has to be remembered here when texts by Anagami were discovered. It was tried to have texts from St. Thomas, kind of super text, while they are usually texts full of agnostics and which are not so ancient as they are claimed to be. We tried and check all of the Gospels and the biblical texts, in particular the Apostles' work, which are the work of historian Carl Luke, who is a critic and uses the same style and the same method of research search for truth. All of this is strengthened in various ways and supported by quite sufficient and abundant documentation. The speaker apologizes he doesn't manage to read his text. There are obviously data coming from Qumran text. We have the legislation of that period, that is the trial by Ponzio Pilato, and we also have archaeological documents which were examined. We have very old testimonies as to the finding of the grave of Christ, and I think that the same is true for Peter's house, which was a fisherman house with very old ancient graffiti, and also for Peter's grave we have testimonies and evidence in many books. Very often the New Testament was criticized because it was the work of believers, and very often this criticism came from people who had an idealistic, individualistic philosophy, who thought that religion relates to dream. But for Christians, religion is based on facts, on real facts. And the point I would like to conclude my speech on is the following. If a lot of discussion was carried out on the Gospels, and especially the miracles which are described in the Gospels, and Maria's virginity, passion represents the point of the Gospel which is never questioned. It doesn't offer any side to criticism or objections because it's not glorious for Christians to have this blame on Christ, and it's kind of shame, and they in a way abandon their Lord They are masters. So the text we have available is quite solid, unquestionable. So as to the historicity of Christ, we have quite solid basis thanks to the texts and documents we have available. I wonder whether our meeting will discuss other texts which strengthen our thesis. However, I don't want to anticipate the conclusions of our symposium.